Hello and welcome to our webinar, Design for Cars as Collaborative Robots or cobots in cooperation with our partner STAR. My name is Leonie Lawrence from We Connect Global Leaders, and I am happy to welcome all our participants here today. And as you can already see, our speaker for today is already here, so let me briefly introduce him to you. We have with us Wolfgang Klein, lead UX designer from STAR, who will talk to us about how cobots can make automotive experiences safer and more productive. Wolfgang has specialized in robotics and IoT and today has more than 10 years experience as a global design consultant and researcher. He has designed mobility services for the automotive and aviation industries, consumer drones, e-bikes and e-car startups, with multiple patents pending for robotic in-car companies in the US. So a wealth of experience here with us today. We're very happy to have you with us. Good morning, Wolfgang.
Good morning, Leonie. Thanks for the introduction.
So before we dive into the topic, just a few words on the setup of today's webinar. All participants in this webinar are in listen-only mode, but please feel free to send in your questions during the webinar by putting them in your control panel. There will be a Q&A session after the talk where we will take the time to answer them. Also, the webinar will be recorded and you will receive access to this recording in the follow-up. And that was all from me for now, and I am very happy to hand over to Wolfgang.
All right, thanks. So let's take it away. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. As Leonie implied, I might be pretty experienced in this field. I'm not experienced in webinars whatsoever, so I'm essentially sitting here in a room on my own talking to myself. But I just trust that you guys are listening nicely and that you're actually interested in the show. So let me just start by flipping to slide number 2, Design for Cars as Cobots. So, not sure how international the crowd is today, but I grew up in Germany, and these were two friends I had as a kid, Luke, the engine driver, and Jim Button, and they have all sorts of adventures. But actually, there's a third character in this picture, and her name is Emma, and she's a steam locomotive. And at some point she can fly, she has this really funny hooting language, and she gets the friends into and out of all sorts of trouble. However, she's just a machine, and there is this one scene in the books and in the puppet show where they actually have to take Emma apart, and it kind of broke my heart to see her, being reduced to a pile of junk. But in the end, that's what she was, even though I had strong feelings for her as a kid. Now, if you think it's a childish behavior to sort of project personality onto a object, think twice, because I think we all know that we've done it in the past. There is actually a scientific term for it. It's called pareidolia. So apparently we humans simply want to see, in this case, faces in all sorts of objects. Now, when we talk about machines, especially in the car industry, or about robots, this is the image that might come to mind. So we have robotic arms in an enclosed space, and there is a human in this picture in the top left corner. So this person is fenced off from the robots, and they don't really have any overlapping activities whatsoever. But the image of robots is changing to become more collaborative and to live alongside us with no fences in between, like this guy. So this is a robot called Atlas by Boston Dynamics, and there is no fence to keep him away from us whatsoever. So how do we respond to that? I think you can agree that the two examples I showed are very different. We have Emma on one hand and Atlas on the other. And if you will, they sit on two opposite sides of a spectrum. Emma is sort of inferior. I mean, she's a friend, but the other two people are the bosses. And she's very relatable. That's why I liked her so much as a child. And Atlas, on the other hand, is potentially superior. He looks very powerful, and he is actually kind of scary, at least for some people and certainly for me. Now, these are only two examples, but luckily for us, Hollywood has been thinking about our relationship with futuristic machines for decades, maybe even centuries, in the case of one of the cases. And why not look at this, and these artists have, in a way, explored these scenarios for us already. So if we go from the utopian side on the left side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen, which is more dystopian, the examples would line up as follows. So this is a screenshot from the movie Her. There is an AI in there called Samantha. And I mean, there are sad twists to the story, and Joaquin Phoenix, the main actor, has to go through a painful character arc and all. But all in all, the machines are benevolent, and they love us so much that Samantha essentially has like 6 relationships or something. And in the end, the machines realize that humans have to sort out their stuff themselves, so they leave us to our own lives. This is Baymax from a Disney movie called Big Hero 6, and he's a sort of gentle giant, sort of slow-witted, but a very, very fierce and loyal friend, so also very utopian. Then the next guy is Data from Star Trek, and I think the only thing that makes him, a little weird is the fact that he looks so bland. He is struggling sometimes with the fact that he doesn't have any emotions, and it gives him a sort of eerie feel. But other than that, again, a very positive scenario in Star Trek. Now, this is Star Wars. 2 very nice robots, or collaborative robots, if you will. They are our friends, but there is also bad machines in the Star Wars franchise. And actually, in the more recent movies, R2-D2, the small fridge-shaped guy, has a sinister twin who works on a Death Star. Then this is Decker from the original Blade Runner movies. And in that case, the machines are living alongside us. They're replicants, so they're really hard to tell from actual human beings. And his job is to sort out rogue machines that are unintelligible from us as human beings. So we're entering a gray area here. This is a snapshot from Disney's WALL-E, and you may remember that WALL-E is this like little junky robot that lives on a post-apocalyptic world, but mankind has survived in outer space and they're completely obsolete. So they're just sitting around consuming. The machines are kind of our friends, but there's certainly a dystopian feel to this scenario where humans are just no longer needed. Then Space Odyssey 2001, you may remember the scene where the AI controls the starship. His name is Hal, represented very iconically by this red camera. And at some point, he decides that he disagrees with the astronaut's agenda and opposes the astronaut directly by locking him out into outer space. And this is the oldest example, Metropolis, not quite 100 years old, and actually from proto-Hollywood, Babelsberg in Germany. But the story here is that an evil scientist creates a superhuman creature, which is very reminiscent of one of the Star Wars robots. So I guess this was on their mood board when they came up with Star Wars 40 years later. And the overall story in Metropolis is that machines are essentially dominating our lives, and we've in a way stopped being human. This idea is even more strongly represented in Terminator. So the machines and humans have been at war with each other for a long time. And in the case of the Matrix, the machines have actually won the war and enslaved mankind. So these are just a couple of, popular culture references that you might recognize that have explored the spectrum of our future relationship with machines in much detail and, of course, great entertainment factor. So back to our initial examples, there is a certain spectrum, and our topic today, collaborative robots, are in the middle of the spectrum. So Emma is imagined, Atlas is real. What are the real collaborative robots going to look like in the future? And since they're, as I see them, right in the middle of the spectrum, I think it's a very interesting topic to discuss. So collaborative robots, just to give you guys the proper definition, according to Forbes magazine, are the latest generation of robotic systems, and they are intended to work alongside humans. So just to make it clear, I'm not a developer, I'm a designer, but still it's very relevant for designers because we like holistic experiences. We usually work towards goal or added value for our users. And of course, we are user-centered. So there's a lot of stuff for us designers to get our hands dirty with in this field. So when we talk about collaborative robots or cobots, this is the picture that comes to mind very often. It's essentially a robotic arm. I think some of the first were developed by a German, now Chinese company, KUKA. But there's not a lot of examples out there. So in order to fill this webinar, we have to cast our net a little wider and also look at adjacent fields in AI. So one field that I would like to look into is drones, which are essentially remote controlled robots or extensions of our body. Then personal robots like Jibo, for example. Then the simpler version of them, Alexa and all sorts of voice assistants who also represent AI. The same thing exists for kids, like in hybrid toys that have both a physical and a digital facet to them. Then entirely virtual characters like Super Mario. So, you know, he has a life, he has a story. And my personal favorite, companion animals. And that might look a little weird, but, you know, we've essentially trained these organic machines, if you will, for the last millennia. And usually they fulfill a very specific purpose. So you can think of them as carbon-based robots, if you will. Now, the question today is, what can we learn from cobots to make automotive experiences more safe, productive, and rewarding? And like Leonie said at the beginning, I've worked in this field for quite a while, and I would like to introduce you to 5 principles illustrated by these nice animations here. So I work for a company called Star and have been doing so for the last 4 years. We're a design and development company globally, and we have worked on like projects in this field in the collaborative robot design for over 3.5 years now. And this is just our way of sharing some of the findings that we made along this journey. So let's talk about principle number 1. So as you saw, there's 5 principles in total and then 1 extra one at the very end. And our first principle is called don't just look cute, be cute. So you guys are all interested in the automotive field, so you may know this case. This is Google's first self-driving car, now called Waymo. I think this picture was taken maybe 7 years ago. And I remember seeing this for the first time and thinking like, okay, this looks horrible. Like, why would anybody design a car this silly? You know, is this supposed to be the future of cars, of self-driving cars? You know, so why does the car look so needy? And it was only later that I realized, you know, it's actually a pretty smart move from Google to make the car look so inferior. Because let's remember, a car is a ton of metal racing around town and can potentially kill people. And if for the first time ever you make this car self-driving, people might be very, very scared from scared by that car. So Google deliberately designed their self-driving car in a very inferior way to make it look less scary. And by the way, I think it's a good rule of thumb to think, okay, if there is a horror version of my product out there on the market, then it's good to take a step back and design as safely as you can. So there has been a homicidal car in a Stephen King novel. So it's a good test to just see if there is potentially any weirdness about your product. So I think it's been very smart to be by Google. Now, I kind of have to include this case because why would Tesla design a car like this? And I think this illustrates our special relationship with cars. I mean, in one way, you can think of them as collaborative robots, as different beings. But at the same time, cars are sort of prosthetics for our own mobility. And I've read that already 120,000 people or so have pre-ordered one of the new Tesla Cybertrucks that you can see on this picture. And my explanation for that is that, you know, they clearly this car is perceived as superior and maybe even threatening. but you can see that there's a person inside the car. So I assume that people want to buy this car because they can in turn feel superior by sitting inside the car. I don't think that pedestrians will appreciate being very close to these cars, which in fact look very intimidating. So the question is, do we look at cars as cobots or as prosthetics for our own body? Now let's take a look at those hybrid toys I mentioned. This is a little toy called Cosmo, and you can see he's like living in your house. He plays tricks on your pet. You can remote control him. He has some supposed educational value, and he's sort of needy and clumsy. You know, he's almost falling over. And the product was very successful. But you also notice the color scheme. You know, he is white and orange, so he looks very friendly. But they knew that the behavior carries a long way. So, bada boom. So this is the successor product of Cosmo called Vector, and you can see that the color scheme is actually kind of dark and green, and it's a typical sci-fi villain color theme. So Slytherin, The Matrix, or Alien all have this color theme. And I think what Vector illustrates is that if you have nice behavior, you don't have to worry about the looks. You know, so Vector has a nice personality, so the makers knew that even if you looked a little menacing, that was okay. So behavior trumps looks. But it's not only about, you know, how the object behaves. This is an example of Amazon Dot, I think it's called, so one of the embodiments of Alexa. And Alexa, of course, is a very complex service. And how do I, as a user, know Alexa is not spying on me? So as a consumer, I don't want to read through all sorts of code in order to understand what the service actually does. But I do understand if I cover the camera, you know, I have physical control over what Alexa sees or it doesn't see. So in this case, Amazon very smartly introduced a physical metaphor to give users a sense of superiority to the object. And by the way, spying on customers is not cool. So this is one of Google Nest's designs. And it turned out, you know, even though it looks so nice with round shapes and white color, there was this camera, or sorry, this microphone inside the object that nobody knew about. And in a way, this gives this little object a very schizophrenic feel. You know, it looks very cute, but it's actually spying on you without telling you. So it's kind of a conflicting offering. So if you look cute, you should also act in a cute way and not spy on people. And that's what this first principle is about. So make the cobot feel gentle or weak to give users a sense of superiority. And, you know, just in order to also incorporate the recent example of Tesla's truck design in this principle, sometimes people can also absorb that superiority by becoming one with the machine. And that's my best way of explaining this really strange design that Tesla came up with. Now, principle number 2, stick to your home turf. This is Jibo. And when I was a grad student like 8 years ago, I remember seeing this and thinking, wow, this is going to be the future of robotics. And I loved it. You know, it looks a little clunky and it's very expensive, $900. But this is a robot that has a body language that lives in your home and that doesn't mimic humans one-to-one. So I thought it was very original. And, you know, it can tell your kids stories, it can help you cook and whatnot. It's a camera, but it went bust a year ago. And why did it fail? And why did Curie, this other object you're seeing here, fail as well? And my explanation is, you know, that they both completely overpromised. So they didn't really know what the offering was except like emotional bonding. And they essentially did everything that Alexa would do too, but in a bad way. And it also turns out that nobody's willing to pay $800 extra in order for Alexa to have a motor and a dance mode. And this is very small print, but you might recognize the Gartner Hype Cycle. This is from this year, July 2019. And smart robotics are in the top left corner. So in case you're not familiar with this graph, so you have an innovation trigger, then everybody thinks, oh my God, this technology is going to change everything. We love it. So you're at the peak of the curve. And then it turns out, oh my God, it's not productive at all. So you're disillusioned with the product. And then it takes another couple of years until you're actually becoming productive. And smart robotics, as illustrated by Gartner's chart here, hasn't even reached that peak of inflated expectations. And I think Jibo is an illustration of that. On the other side of the spectrum, you have this. This is a successful cobot called Kubo, and all it does is it has fur, sits on your lap at home, and wiggles its tail. So that's a very niche use case, but it also costs $130, but it's a sustainable offering apparently because people buy it. So I think the story here is stay niche to stay affordable. Speaking of weirdly moving objects, this is another one of Boston Dynamics robots, and all it does is carry parcels. But I think it's just so beautiful and elegant. You know, it's like this sort of dancing ostrich, for lack of a better metaphor. So here, you know, again, you have one very, very specific use case, carrying parcels around, and you get a very, very unique design out of that. And even though it's completely guided by functionality, it does come across as alive and as another entity. You may have seen this since you all work in automotive. So this is a product called Nomi by a Chinese electric vehicle company, NIO. And it's essentially the small blob that lives on your dashboard inside the car, and it has facial expressions. In a way, it's the physical embodiment of the car's AI. So I think it's easy to disregard this as sort of, you know, Chinese silliness or, you know, something emotional that has no value whatsoever, but it is successful. And I think the reason why it is successful is that, you know, Nomi lives inside a controlled ecosystem and NIO controls that ecosystem. So nobody else can get in essentially if they don't want them to. And this in turn allows Nomi to really stand out and become this focal point that users can project their relationship with the car onto. So even though it also has a motor and it's also kind of silly, it has value and people appreciate it because it's the boss in its own realm. Now, principle number 2 is about making the cobot part of a service ecosystem with clear functions to meet users' basic needs. So on to principle number 3, show it's just a machine. You guys may be familiar with the term uncanny valley, and this is a simplified graph of it, but you have essentially acceptability on the vertical axis and human likeness on the horizontal axis. And the top left moment would essentially be that something is clearly not human, so I can accept that. You know, this is clearly a car, I can accept that. On the other side of the graph, we have something that is clearly human, like me, for example, and you can clearly accept that. But if you have something in between that is neither machine nor human being, you get something like this, you know, and this is kind of creepy. Or since this is an automotive themed event, I also found this example from an 80s cartoon called Turbo Teen. And believe it or not, this guy turns into a car every time he is hot. So he's a boy at the beginning, no problem. But then, you know, his hands turn into wheels and that's kind of painful. And then he gets this really enormous butt and then look at his face changing. It's just not nice at all. So, but now he's a car and that's fine. So what we've essentially done was just traverse the uncanny valley from left to right. Now, there's no shame whatsoever in clearly showing that your product is a machine. You know, so this is a project or product by Teenage Engineering called Raven R, and obviously this is a machine with a bunch of gears, a bunch of robotic arms. It doesn't even have a face. It has a dot matrix, but I would argue that it is very, very much alive. So they found a mechanism and orchestrated it in a lifelike way. And they didn't have to mimic human likeness at all to create that illusion. Now, the other upside of showing that your machine is just a machine is that nobody can claim that you're just a dressed up actor, as in this case. So there was this tech convention in Russia, and you know, this feat of engineering turned out to be just a dude in a suit of armor. So being transparent about your technology will certainly avoid that. And we've mentioned Wally before. I've seen it on every single mood board of IoT and robotics since I've started working in this industry. He's really just a pile of junk, but people love him. This is another example from mobility. A Munich-based startup, so I'm also based in Munich, so it's close to my heart, called Lilium, and they have found this really unique mode of propulsion for a air taxi. And I mean, it isn't a character, but I would say that it has character thanks to a very, very iconic design, where again, the form follows the function, and in turn, you get a very, very unique creature. You know, this is not a car or it's not a helicopter, it's something else. So we talked about physical design a lot, but the idea that you want to show that your cobot is just a machine also extends to verbal communication. So Amazon users in the UK who were parents realized that their kids had this really bossy tone when talking to Alexa. And if you have kids, you might have noticed this yourself. You know, the kid talks to Alexa and Alexa doesn't need thank you or please in order to obey. Now, this alarmed parents in the UK, and this in turn triggered Amazon to introduce what they call a politeness mode. So now Alexa only responds if the kid says thank you and please. I think it's an interesting illustration of how our interaction with the robots, if done poorly, can contaminate our communication with humans. You know, I think that the parents feared that the child learns to boss things around and that it will become more rude next time it talks to your neighbors or something. So what Alexa didn't do was clearly separate communication between human to human and human to machine. And I would like to give you one example for companion animals where this has been successfully completed. You know, so this is a Bavarian lumberjack called a Holzrücker, and he works very, very closely with one of those labor horses. So they operate very difficult terrain, and they have a very intimate working relationship. And the horse is trained to heed the lumberjack's commands. But when the lumberjack talks to the horse, he doesn't speak human language with the horse, he speaks Horsish. So instead of saying left and right, he would say wüst and hot. So I don't really know why, you know, but I'm assuming that millennia of working with horses or other companion animals have showed us that it's kind of weird to talk to animals like you would to human beings. You may have seen a person, you know, in public do that with their dog, and it's always kind of weird. So this is essentially what Alexa got wrong the first time around. You know, we might not want to talk to machines like we talk to humans. So this third principle is about keeping the technology or the otherness of the horse in the last case obvious so that users can easily step in and out of the illusion. On to principle number 4, which might sound a little contradictory, stay in character. So you want to give your cobot a clear character. This is a robotic seal, and it's called Paro, and it's been around for, I think, 15 years already. And it's very good at putting dementia patients at ease. So the seal sits on the patient's lap, and the patient can just cuddle it, and the robotic seal blinks and is generally happy. And you have to watch the videos. People love it. Now, but it's just a robot, right? So at some point it runs out of energy. And it would be really, you know, weird to just rip the fur off and plug the electric cable in. So what the makers came up with was a new metaphor for how Paro, the seal, can recharge, and it involves a pacifier. So whenever Paro has run out of electricity, you plug a pacifier in its mouth, and then it needs some me time, and it essentially recharges. Now, obviously, seals don't use pacifiers. And by the way, the very first generation of Paro was based on dogs. But people, you know, realized, or they had experience with dogs, so they knew, okay, this is not how a dog acts. So they essentially turned it into a seal because nobody knows what a seal acts like. But I'm pretty sure it doesn't have a pacifier. But still, what the makers did was they found a new metaphor for the off state. They integrated the recharging experience into a lifelike overall illusion. This is an example of a robotic arm. And here it's sort of the same thing. We want to keep the metaphors consistent. So what you do when you train this robotic arm to kind of carry objects from here to there is you just take him by the hand and you show him where to lift up the boxes and where to drop them again. So again, we're staying within a coherent world of metaphors by just using physicality as an input. But the idea of staying in character also extends beyond edge cases. You all know Siri, I'm sure. And what I really like about this visualization is that it can exist in any medium. So right now, Siri exists on your phone as those little wavy line, on your laptop, also as a small icon in the top right corner. She also exists on the HomePod in this sort of light show on top of the smart speaker. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing her in VR, as this sentient haze floating around my home. And visualizing for all media will allow your cobot to look the same in all of its embodiments. Because what AI can do is they can leave their body and inhibit different objects. But Siri is recognizable no matter which shape she takes. And again, I think very, very iconic design in Knight Rider. I'm not a David Hasselhoff fan, but I'm a fan of KIT. And KIT is essentially three LED bars that move up and down. And I have a feeling sooner or later, some automaker will come up with something very, very similar and essentially create this abstract version of Nomi that can create in all sorts of different media because of the simplicity of the visualization. Now, this is a little spin on the topic, so you may recognize from this very, very rudimentary sheet the different generations of car front designs from BMW. Of course, when people usually talk about this, they might say, okay, this is the BMW DNA. We have like the two kidneys as air inlets and so on and so forth. And I'm just inviting you to think of this not as a evolution of the car front. I'm inviting you to think of this as, the same character of the car, just like Siri, inhibiting different objects over the course of a century. And I think that's just an interesting play on metaphors. And lastly, in order to illustrate this point about staying in character, I'd like to talk about Super Mario, because the makers were really smart about hiding the requirements of the technology in a story. So follow me back to, Japan in the 1980s, 90s, where the makers were essentially just discussing how to design Super Mario. So they knew, okay, so we don't have a lot of pixels, so we have to make the character work with just, 20 by 20 pixels, but we cannot animate the face or hair, so what should we do? Yeah, let's just put a mustache on him and a hat on his head. Then it's easier to animate. Okay, yeah, that's cool, that's cool. Now he looks kind of Italian. Yeah, he looks Italian, right? So he's essentially Italian, but now we also need a way to animate him going from screen to screen. How can we do that? Yeah, maybe he can follow pipes or tubes. Yeah, that's a cool idea. So he's essentially an Italian plumber, and that's how they came up with the story for Super Mario. Again, the dialogue was just improvised, but they essentially hid the requirements of the technology in the story of this character. And that allowed them to build a coherent world around very, very rudimentary technology compared to our own. So funny story, but this principle is about finding metaphors for all situations so that users can have a coherent mental image of the cobot, regardless of which use case we're talking about. So this is my last principle, principle number 5, and then I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A more or less. So the last one is about fostering emotional bonds. This is a case we looked at before, Curie, also funded by Bosch, and now bankrupt. Now, I think it went bankrupt for the same reasons as Chibo, as we discussed before. But what I like about this design is, like, first of all, Curie has very simple eyes. They work only mechanically. You can sort of see the cheeks push into the eyes to make it look like he smiles. He can also frown with the invert effect. But they have reserved a different medium for moments of special emotional arousal. So in this picture, you can see his heart glow. I think it's kind of cheesy, you know, it doesn't exist in the natural world, but I think it creates a moment of vulnerability where you can essentially see inside Curie and see that he is really, you know, agitated in a happy way. So we're reserving a special medium for moments of strong emotion. And I wonder where they had the idea from. You know, this is E.T. with his glowing heart. So this is looks like a far stretch, but let me talk you through it. So this is another Munich startup. So again, you know, proud to be from Munich, called A-Car. So these guys thought or set out to design a car for Africa, hence the name. And they wanted to make sure that it's very easy to repair. You don't need any special equipment to repair it. It's very robust, and you have an electric vehicle. So they started the startup, and then they were surprised that they received a lot of orders from Germany. You know, why was that? You know, they were designing it for Africa in the first place. And I think everybody likes robustness. And my personal opinion about cars is that fixing them bonds you to the car. Now, right now, we have a service and maintenance culture around cars that alienates the users from the car very, very much. Nobody on earth, at least nobody I know, can fix a car that has been produced in 2019 by themselves at home. You have to go to a very specialized garage and leave your car there, and then somebody else fixes it. Now, why am I talking about this? We have seen in bicycles a culture of people fixing and making their own bikes, and that's the fixie culture, of course. I personally enjoy fixing objects, and it makes them grow very, very close to my heart. And I'm just inviting you to consider, okay, so what if we fixed our cars ourselves? I have a couple of friends who do that, and the emotional bond that it creates is unparalleled. So A-Car is one example of this trend potentially spilling over into the car industry. There is another startup from Germany whose name I forgot, unfortunately, but it's essentially the same story. Are they called Sonos or something like that? Something along those lines, starts with an S. And the idea is also that you can fix your car yourself. And I think it's gonna create a very, very close relationship between customers or drivers and cars. You may know the very, very first vacuum cleaner, smart vacuum cleaner, was built by Electrolux. And unfortunately, you can't fix your vacuum cleaner yourself. Even the vacuum cleaner is too complex nowadays. But if you have one of those, I'm quite sure that you have given it a name. And I have a selection of vacuum cleaner names here. And apparently the most popular one in English-speaking countries is Rosie, based on a character from a cartoon from the US. And then other examples include Jarvis, Wally, R2D2, Alfred, Bob, or Dirty Harry. So why do people name their vacuum cleaners? My guess, again, is that vacuum cleaners live in our home, they move in our home, and our home is a circle of trust. And by awarding this object a name, we kind of make it more a part of our family than it would be otherwise. So again, there is a want for people to have an emotional bond with the objects in their vicinity. And this is, I think, my second to last case that I want to talk about. The first robotic dog from Sony was called Aibo. I think it was created in the early 90s or something. So the robot was supported by Sony for more than a decade, but now you may know that the new robot dog by Sony came out, Aibo 2. It looks much better, it's much more expensive, and Sony stopped supporting the old one that you can see here. So that meant that a lot of long-standing Aibo owners had to say goodbye to their dog forever. So what do you do with a dying robot dog? Nobody knew. And this is where this guy comes in. He is a monk in a Japanese shrine, and he and his brethren specialize in funerals for robot dogs. Now, this might sound very weird, but I think it's sort of understandable, for users to be sad if their robotic dog dies. Again, this has been in their home for more than a decade. And Sony didn't really consider designing for the entire life cycle of this product, which I'm encouraging you to do. So if you temper with your users' emotions and make them feel something for the robot, I would encourage us all to handle that responsibility with care, and also consider the offboarding experience, if you will. Now, again, this is a Far Eastern phenomenon, and I hear from a lot of Westerners that they think, over there, people are more likely to project personality into objects, or that maybe the uncanny valley is much smaller. But I disagree. And this is one illustration for that. So that's another companion animal example, if you will. A scene from a video game called Red Dead Redemption 2. So this is essentially a Western game, and you as a cowboy, I don't know, solve riddles and shoot people. And you also ride a lot of horses. So you spend a lot of time on horseback. What we're seeing here is a scene where the player is petting the horse. And if the player is nice to their horse, it increases the horse's stats. So the horse will run faster if you treat it nicely. I think it's a beautiful game mechanism, but again, we're sort of playing with the user's emotions here. And the sad story is, from what I hear, I haven't played it myself, that no matter what you do, your first horse will get killed about 2 hours into the game for dramatic purposes. It's kind of like in Game of Thrones, where deaths make you appreciate the seriousness of the game more. So I did some research and I found a lot of comments from devastated gamers online, and these are all from like the United States or Europe. And I would like to read out a quote from a gamer called Blaine to you. So he wrote, "I spent 3 or 4 hours bonding with my horse and increasing its stats, only for its life to be taken away prematurely by some bounty hunters. I was devastated, and this is the important part. I never anticipated that a game would make me feel this way about a death, any death, not just a horse's death. It was really strange to feel anything at all for a virtual horse." So let's be, serious about playing with our users' emotions, and I think it's both it's a global phenomenon. So this story is about letting users develop a long-term relationship with the cobot so they are more satisfied with it. So these were my 5 principles. Thank you all for listening. It's been a very one-sided conversation, but I think that's because this is a webinar. I'm looking forward to your questions. Before that, I also want to share with you one last half principle, which is to seek far-fetched inspiration. So this is an evolving industry. We don't really know how cobots are going to play out for us. But I would like to share some advice with you that I received from one of my professors back in my master studies in Zurich and Chicago. And my professor said, so when you design for robots, come up with 3 concepts and make one like a butler, one like a dog, and one like a jellyfish. I'm like, okay, I can see the butler. This is obviously a humanoid servant that we all know. I kind of see the point about the dog because, like I said before, they do work for us and we love them for millennia. But why the jellyfish? And the jellyfish is kind of interesting because it's an alien life form. It glows and it does things very differently, but still we can use it to express whatever the user cares about. And designing a new language for this new form of life or machine. So next time we go to work, let's all think about jellyfish a little more. So thank you very much. And with this, I would like to invite Leonie to maybe curate the questions for the Q&A. So we have about 15 minutes for that.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for your presentation. We do already have a few questions in, so let's get started right away. The first one is emotional design is about creating aesthetically pleasing connections between users and the product. But does it fulfill the functional user's needs?
Yeah, good question. I mean, first of all, emotional design, I think we have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to serious considerations of emotions. So I read this interview with a Swiss lady who has essentially started scientific research in emotions, believe it or not, in the 1970s. So apparently she's a psychologist, and apparently nobody really cared about human emotions as a serious field of study for 100, 150 years. So we have a lot of catching up to do, and I think it's very important. Maybe so about the second part of the question, talking about emotionality and functionality, I think what most of the cases I showed you today are really good at is aligning expectations between the user and the object. And so the question, to rephrase it, is what functional purpose do our emotions have when we design for machines? And I remember, so I gave this talk at a conference in Berlin, Car HMI, so that's also an automotive conference. And one of the participants asked, so, why is this important? How does this help us align expectations? And I gave the person this example of voice assistants in cars. So you may be aware that Tesla names its self-driving quite differently from other companies. And it is assumed, and there have been a couple of court court cases where Tesla had to reinvestigate the naming of their self-driving modes because the expectations were set wrong. Now, just for the sake of argument, what I replied to that guy's question in Berlin was, so just imagine that the car spoke to you not like this mature female voice that we usually hear, for example, in Mercedes, but like the surfer dude, like a person that you would not necessarily trust with driving your car. So if the AI assistant spoke in a way that for us as human beings sounded kind of untrustworthy or not serious, then I'm quite sure that the expectations that you have for the self-driving mode, for example, are much lower. And in a way, this emotional metaphor makes sure that the functions are sharpened, right? So that's just one example or one way to answer your question.
Great, thank you. The next question actually picks up on the first, so maybe let's take this one as our next. I would rephrase this first question a bit and say, how can utility functionality be aligned with emotions?
How can utility functionality be aligned with emotions? Yeah, probably in the same way. So I think one thing is about aligning expectations, like I said before. But I already mentioned the voice assistant of Mercedes, and I would like to talk about that specifically a little bit more in regards to that question. So what the voice assistant in Mercedes does is, like you say, Mercedes or hey Mercedes, and then no matter if you continue talking, like hey Mercedes, how can I get there? The AI doesn't care, so every time you say Mercedes, it takes the AI about 3 seconds to say, yes, what can I do for you? And that's very frustrating if you're driving in this car for a very long time, because the makers of the system probably thought, hey, we have to make the communication with our AI as personal as possible, whether the user wants to or not. But I, as a user, am losing a lot of time because of this insisting on humanizing the interaction. And I didn't like that at all. It takes a lot of time out of your experience. So to answer that question, I think we have to make sure that we only play this game of emotionalizing technology when the user wants that and when they have time for that. And forcing the person to listen to the same answer from an AI every time you ask a question is probably not the solution.
Okay, and is there consistency with emotional states during the use of functionality?
Wow, that's a very detailed question. Can you say that again? Is there consistency in the emotions?
with the emotional states during the use of functionality.
Is the consistency with the emotional states? I mean, in terms of consistency and emotional states, what comes to my mind specifically when we talk about automotive, which is what this webinar is about, is a clean tonal escalation ladder. So just imagine you are driving a semi-automated car, which can be one of the most frustrating experiences in automotive, at least for me, because you never know what the car is up to, you know, and you feel like the car knows it all because it has all the sensors, but it is limited in its actuators, you know, so the car cannot act on everything. It needs you as a bottleneck. So I think that's very frustrating. And it's also very interesting in terms of this question, like the consistency. So whenever the car does something, it can feel surprising and weird. And what I would encourage everybody, you know, to do is to make sure that the car slowly but steadily increases its tonal urgency every time it does something. So let's just imagine that, you know, an obstacle is 100 meters away. So what I'm expecting the car to do is kind of, you know, take care of my emotions and not alarm me in a disproportionate amount. So it just notify me, hey, there's an obstacle in 100 meters or maybe even a mile or something. So the closer I get, the notification becomes bigger, the emotional urgency becomes higher. And then at some point, you know, the car gives me this short veto window. Okay, if you don't brake, I'll brake. And then you're still going ahead. And then you're about to bump into the obstacle, so the car just brakes. And that's sort of the pinnacle of the emotional escalation ladder. And, you know, I could be very much upset by that. But luckily for us, you know, we have made sure that the tonal urgency increases over time. So, or as a visual example on the center screen or cluster screen, you know, the notification was this size, and then at some point it was this size. So I think a steady escalation ladder is very important when it comes to emotional consistency. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Then let's just skip to the next question. I have a question regarding character building. Has there been a study on the gender of the robot character, particularly in voice interaction?
Yeah, very good question. So I don't have any representative scientific data, unfortunately, but I think the rumors in the industry are that the first generations of AI were all kind of sexist. So Siri is female, Alexa is female, who else? Like Cortana is female, you know, so why is that? And my best guess is that they were all based on this idea of, you know, post-war secretaries. When it comes to like human servants, I think there are three metaphors that I can think of. Ironically, I was always expecting butlers to be the most prevalent human metaphor for a servant, you know, because we know them from all of those movies. And if you know the early beginnings of interaction design, there were a lot of concepts of like virtual butlers in the 70s or so. And those are obviously male. Then I can think of geishas. So that's from Japan, you know, and they're also human servants, mostly focused on entertainment. And then the last one, and I think this is what those three voice assistants I just mentioned build on, is the post-war secretary, you know, like so a female person, very nicely dressed, in charge of all of your organizing at work, but not really taking any decisions. And I think that actually irritated a lot of people, and I think rightly so, you know, because obviously our work life has changed compared to the post-war era. But to answer your question, no, unfortunately, I don't have representative data on, you know, the gendering of AI, but I think we're going to see diversification. Also, I think we're not only going to see diversification in gender, we're also going to see diversification in age. So I think some of the AI is going to be more playful and maybe childlike. And I think we're going to also see some diversification in personality. So that surfer dude is just one example that came to my mind earlier. You know, you could also have one drill instructor AI for your workout routine, or another AI from the movie Her that I like very much is this small alien that uses very abusive language. So there is not only Samantha in the movie, there's also this small weird alien. and he is really cracking up the character, Joaquin Phoenix. So I think it's going to diversify. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question is, as a virtual assistant for the car, do you strongly suggest 3D physical cobots as opposed to fully virtual assistant whereby you only hear the voice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice question. No, I would recommend both, or I would recommend a strategy. So I think the Siri example and maybe also that BMW front design example illustrates that AI personality or even brand personality should be able to inhibit different embodiments. So Siri can migrate. So the term in robotics is migration, when the AI possesses different physical properties. And the challenge, as I see it, is to find a visual language just like Siri that will work in all sorts of different media, phone, your laptop, VR, but maybe, you know, also some sort of small, nice installation I can put in my home. You know, there are really beautiful kinetic sculptures from artists in the 70s, particularly, or I don't know, a smart poster on the wall that tells me my driving stats in a really, really unobtrusive way. So I think the challenge is to make sure that you have one kernel or one DNA that will always look the same, regardless of whether the viewport or the medium is this size or that size. It's a little bit like widget design for cars right now. So ideally, you know, you have a smart way of handling all of your functions and widgets in the car. And when the music player is this size, I should recognize it. And when it's this size, I should also recognize it. So the goal is to have an overarching strategy, undoubtedly.
Thank you. The next question is, when it comes to the car, why should we add another passenger and make sure that he or she will not be distracting the driver's concentration?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So I think there's two parts of the question. So why are passengers in the car important? And the other one is, how do we responsibly deal with the driver's attention span? So I think it's true for any design to be mindful of the user's attention. You know, there is this trend of managing your screen time more actively. There is also this trend of dopamine fasting in the Silicon Valley. So the idea is that you don't use your phone very much. And you may also be aware that there is this dark pattern, you know, especially advocated by the big players in digital services like Google, Facebook, and so on, that just capitalize on putting you in that dopamine loop. You know, you kind of, so dopamine is our hormone for to-do list happiness. So every time we complete a task, we get a little like rush of dopamine. And I think that's very irresponsible, you know, and it's even more irresponsible in the driving context because, you know, lives are at stake. So again, what you will need to do is come up with a strategy of like, when do I do what and how can I gauge the driver's cognitive load? So I would say that if the driver's cognitive load is saturated, you know, and they are busy with other things like driving in a very stressful situation, obviously you shouldn't add to that cognitive load by telling the driver a joke completely offhand, you know, so that's certainly not desirable. But then again, you know, drivers can have boring commutes. They can be stuck in their car. They can be stuck in a traffic jam. There is more cognitive load, and potentially also the danger of the driver feeling lonely or, you know, left or sort of being alone in a hostile world. So I think that's something that a driver or a passenger can alleviate. Like, first of all, and I think we're running out of time, so I'll keep this short. Adding a second passenger, why not? You know, if you have a good time, I think that's always good. And it is not necessarily the case that the AI or the manifestation of the AI in the car always represents the car or the company AI. You know, it could also be that your blinking lights or your Nomi or whatever represents somebody you care about very far away. You know, so just imagine that the AI turns green as opposed to blue when you know that your spouse is already at home. You know, so that's a really nice way of using that canvas for its actual purpose, which is, hopefully making us happy.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, as you just mentioned, with regard to the time, I think we will leave it at there. For the questions, thank you very much for our audience for tuning in today and also for taking part so actively in our Q&A session. Thank you, of course, to you, Wolfgang, for your presentation today and for answering all these questions. If there are any more questions that come to you, our audience, later, feel free to keep sending them in to me, to leonielawrence@reconnect.com. I will be happy to pass them on. And now I would just hand over to you, Wolfgang, one last time for some final words.
Exactly. Yeah. So thanks, guys, for attending. I hope it was actually easy to listen to me. Unfortunately, I couldn't really gauge your attention because of the webinar format. If you've asked a question, thank you. We have actually a little card deck version of this talk prepared, and we would like to send that your way. So we might reach out to you, and then you can actually read through all of these insights and some more at your leisure at home. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you again from my side, and bye-bye to everyone, and I hope you have a nice day. Goodbye.
All right. Bye, guys.